Lucas Harrow, a racist cop, arrests black FBI agent's daughter Lily over a suspicious theft accusation, but just 3 minutes later, Lily's father Mason strikes back, turning the officer's world upside down with brutal revenge. What hidden dangers lie beneath the surface, and how far will a father go to protect his child? The sun shone brightly on the busy city streets as Lily Bennett made her way through the crowd. Her heart was light, and a big smile played on her lips. Today was special. She was on a mission to find the perfect birthday gift for her mom. Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement as she spotted the fancy jewelry store up ahead. The glittering window display made her pause for a moment. She took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy glass door. A little bell jingled as she stepped inside. The store was quiet and cool, a stark contrast to the noisy street outside. Lily's eyes widened as she took in all the sparkling treasures around her. "Can I help you, miss?" a kind voice asked. Lily turned to see a smiling lady behind the counter. "Oh, yes, please," she said. "I'm looking for a birthday gift for my mom." The lady's smile grew warmer. "That's so thoughtful of you. Do you have something in mind?" Lily bit her lip, thinking hard. "Well, my mom loves necklaces, and her favorite color is blue." "I think I have just the thing," the lady said, leading Lily to a display case. As Lily looked at the beautiful necklaces, she thought about her dad, Mason. He had always taught her the importance of showing love through actions, not just words. This gift was her way of doing just that. Mason Bennett wasn't just her dad, he was her hero. As an FBI agent, he spent his days fighting for justice, but to Lily, he was the one who made her pancakes on Sunday mornings and helped her with her math homework. "Your mom is lucky to have such a caring daughter," the lady said, interrupting Lily's thoughts. Lily felt her cheeks grow warm. "Thanks," she said softly. "My dad always says it's important to show people how much we care." The lady nodded. "Your dad sounds like a wise man." "He is," Lily agreed, her chest swelling with pride. As Lily continued to browse, she thought about all the times her dad had encouraged her to be kind and thoughtful. Like the time she wanted to skip her friend's birthday party because she was too tired, Mason had gently reminded her how she'd feel if her friends didn't come to her party. Or when she was nervous about giving a speech in class, and he helped her practice for hours. He always said, "Lily, the most important thing is to speak from your heart." Now, standing in this fancy store, Lily felt grateful for all those lessons. She wasn't just buying a necklace, she was showing her mom how much she cared, just like her dad had taught her. Lily's eyes danced from one sparkling display to another, her heart fluttering with excitement. Each necklace seemed more beautiful than the last, and she found herself lost in a world of glittering gems and shining metals. As she moved closer to a display of delicate pendants, Lily felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She glanced up, only to find a well-dressed woman staring at her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. The woman, who Lily would later learn was Mrs. Hawthorne, wore an expensive-looking suit and a frown that seemed etched into her face. Her eyes never left Lily as she leaned over to whisper something to a nearby store employee. Lily's cheeks grew warm as she noticed the employee's suspicious glance in her direction. She tried to focus on the necklaces in front of her, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to touch a pretty silver chain. "Is everything okay?" Lily wanted to ask, but the words stuck in her throat. She'd never felt so out of place before. The joy she'd felt earlier began to fade, replaced by an annoying anxiety that made her want to run from the store. But Lily thought of her mom and the perfect gift she was determined to find. She took a deep breath, just like her dad had taught her when she felt nervous. "I belong here just as much as anyone else," she reminded herself silently. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes boring into her back. Every time Lily moved to a different display, she could hear whispers and feel stares following her. The beautiful jewelry store now felt more like a cage, with Lily trapped inside. She tried to ignore the looks, focusing instead on finding the perfect gift for her mom. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. As Lily stepped out of the jewelry store, her heart heavy with disappointment, she took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. She hadn't found the perfect gift for her mom, but she was relieved to be free from the uncomfortable atmosphere inside. Her moment of relief was short-lived. A stern voice called out, "Excuse me, miss. Stop right there." Lily turned to see a police officer striding toward her, his face set in a hard frown. Her stomach dropped as he approached, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "I'm Officer Lucas Harrow," he said, his voice gruff and authoritative. "We've had a report of a missing necklace from the display case. I need you to empty your pockets." Lily's eyes widened in shock. "What? But I didn't take anything." Her voice trembled as she spoke, her hands shaking at her sides. Officer Lucas's eyes narrowed. "That's what they all say. Now, empty your pockets or I'll have to search you myself." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes as she fumbled with her jacket pockets. "Please, there's been a mistake. I was just looking. I swear I didn't take anything." As Lily turned out her empty pockets, a small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk. Whispers and pointed fingers made Lily's cheeks burn with embarrassment. "She looks guilty," one onlooker muttered. "Poor girl. She seems so scared," another whispered. Officer Lucas's voice grew louder and more aggressive. "Where did you hide it? In your bag? Your shoes?" Lily's voice cracked as she pleaded, "I didn't take anything. Please, you have to believe me." The crowd grew larger, their whispers becoming a dull roar in Lily's ears. She felt trapped, surrounded by accusing eyes and judgmental stares. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bag close to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I want to call my dad," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Lucas scoffed. "You can call your dad from the station. Now, hand over your bag." Lily's world seemed to spin around her. She couldn't believe this was happening. Just minutes ago, she had been excited about finding a gift for her mom. Now, she was being accused of theft in front of a growing crowd of strangers. As Officer Lucas reached for her bag, Lily took a step back, her eyes darting around frantically, searching for a friendly face in the sea of onlookers. But all she saw were curious stares and disapproving frowns. As the tension escalated, a commanding voice cut through the crowd. "What's going on here?" The sea of onlookers parted, revealing a tall, imposing man with a determined stride. It was Mason Bennett, Lily's father. His face was etched with concern and anger. Lily's eyes lit up with relief. "Dad," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. Mason quickly made his way to his daughter's side, placing a protective arm around her trembling shoulders. He turned to face Officer Lucas, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I'm Mason Bennett, FBI," he said, his voice calm but authoritative as he flashed his badge. "What's the meaning of this?" Officer Lucas's demeanor shifted slightly, but he stood his ground. "This young woman is suspected of shoplifting a valuable necklace from the jewelry store," he stated firmly. Mason's eyebrows furrowed. "And what evidence do you have to support this accusation?" Lucas hesitated for a moment. "We received a report." A report is not evidence, Mason interrupted, his voice sharp. Have you checked the security cameras? Searched my daughter? Found any stolen property? The crowd watched in hushed silence as the confrontation unfolded. Lily clung to her father's side, drawing strength from his presence. Lucas's face reddened. I was in the process of conducting a search when you arrived, he said defensively. Mason's eyes narrowed. Without probable cause or a warrant? I don't think so. He turned to Lily, his voice softening. Sweetheart, did you take anything from the store? Lily shook her head vigorously. No, Dad. I swear I didn't. Mason nodded, then faced Lucas again. My daughter says she's innocent, and you have no evidence to the contrary. I demand that you release her immediately. The tension in the air was palpable as Lucas and Mason stared each other down. Suddenly, Lucas's radio crackled to life. Officer Harrow, a stern voice came through. Report back to the precinct immediately. Lucas's face fell, realizing the situation had escalated beyond his control. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. This isn't over, he muttered before turning on his heel and striding away. As Lucas retreated, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers fading into the background. Mason hugged Lily tightly, feeling her body shake with silent sobs. It's okay, sweetheart, he murmured, stroking her hair. You're safe now. Let's go home. As the tension began to dissipate, Lucas's face softened unexpectedly. He took a deep breath and turned to face Lily and Mason. I owe you both an apology, Lucas said, his voice low and hesitant. I may have overreacted in this situation. Lily and Mason exchanged surprised glances. The crowd that remained watched in stunned silence. Lucas continued, his eyes meeting Lily's. Miss Bennet, I'm sorry for putting you through this ordeal. It was unprofessional of me to make accusations without proper evidence. He then turned to Mason. Agent Bennet, I apologize for my conduct. I should have handled this situation more carefully. Mason studied Lucas's face, trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. While the apology seemed genuine, a nagging doubt lingered in his mind. He nodded curtly, acknowledging Lucas's words, but not quite ready to forgive. Thank you for the apology, Officer Harrow, Mason said, his tone measured. I hope this serves as a learning experience. As Lucas walked away, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his actions. Lily tugged gently on her father's sleeve. Dad, she whispered, her voice still shaky. There's something else you should know. Mason looked down at his daughter, concern etched on his face. What is it, sweetheart? Lily took a deep breath. Inside the store, there was this woman, Mrs. Hawthorne. She kept watching me like she was suspicious of something. It made me really uncomfortable. Mason's brow furrowed as he processed this new information. Mrs. Hawthorne? Do you know her? Lily shook her head. No, I've never seen her before, but she was whispering to one of the employees and pointing at me. A troubled look crossed Mason's face. He gently squeezed Lily's shoulder. That's important information, Lily. Thank you for telling me. As they stood there, the bustle of the city continuing around them, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this incident than met the eye. The pieces didn't quite fit together, Lucas's aggressive behavior, his sudden apology, and now this mysterious Mrs. Hawthorne. Something wasn't right. And Mason was determined to get to the bottom of it. Mason gently guided Lily to his car, his protective arm around her shoulders. As they drove home, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach. Something about this whole situation just didn't add up. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked, glancing at Lily. She nodded, but her eyes were distant. "I just can't believe that happened. It was so scary, Dad." Mason's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I know, honey. I'm sorry you had to go through that. But we'll figure this out. I promise." As they pulled into their driveway, Mason's mind was racing. He kept replaying the scene in his head, focusing on the brief exchange he'd witnessed between Mrs. Hawthorne and the store employee just before Lily was confronted. Once inside, Mason made sure Lily was comfortable and had everything she needed. "Why don't you rest for a bit?" "I need to make a few calls." Lily nodded, curling up on the couch with a blanket. Mason kissed her forehead before heading to his home office. He sat at his desk, determination etched on his face. This wasn't just about clearing Lily's name anymore. His instincts told him there was something deeper going on. And he was going to get to the bottom of it. Mason picked up his phone and dialed the jewelry store's number. After a brief conversation with the receptionist, he was connected to the manager. "Hello, this is FBI agent Mason Bennett," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'd like to discuss the incident that occurred at your store earlier today, involving my daughter." The manager sounded nervous. "Oh, yes, that was unfortunate. How can I help you, Agent Bennett?" "I'd like to come in and review any security footage you have from today," Mason replied. "I believe there may be more to this situation than what appeared on the surface." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Agent Bennett. When would you like to come in?" "I'll be there in an hour," Mason said firmly. After hanging up, Mason checked on Lily once more, before grabbing his keys. He had a determined look in his eyes as he headed out the door. Whatever was going on, he was going to uncover the truth. And make sure justice was served. Mason arrived at the jewelry store, his determined stride carrying him through the glass doors. The manager, a balding man in his 50s, greeted him with a nervous smile. "Agent Bennett, thank you for coming," the manager said, wringing his hands. "I'm Mr. Spencer. How can I assist you today?" Mason's keen eyes scanned the store, taking in every detail. "I'd like to review the security footage from the time my daughter was here." Mr. Spencer's smile faltered. "Yes, about that. We've been having some technical issues with our security system." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? What kind of issues?" "Well, you see," Mr. Spencer stammered, "there seems to be a gap in the footage during the time your daughter was in the store." Mason's suspicion grew, a knot forming in his stomach. "That's quite a coincidence, don't you think?" Mr. Spencer nodded nervously. "Yes, it is unfortunate timing. We've called our tech support, but they haven't been able to recover the missing footage yet." Mason crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "I'd still like to see what you do have. Perhaps we can piece together what happened." "I'm not sure that would be helpful," Mr. Spencer said, his eyes darting around the store. "Without the crucial footage, it might just cause more confusion." Mason leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Spencer, I'm here as part of an official investigation. I'd appreciate your full cooperation in this matter." The manager swallowed hard. "Of course, Agent Bennett. It's just our policy. We need to protect our customers' privacy." Mason's patience was wearing thin. "I understand privacy concerns, but this is about clearing my daughter's name. Surely you can see how important this is." Mr. Spencer nodded reluctantly. "I'll see what I can do, but I can't promise anything." As the manager fumbled with excuses, Mason made mental notes. Something wasn't right here, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. He'd need to look into the store's history, check for any previous incidents or complaints. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Spencer," Mason said, his tone measured. "I'll be in touch. And I expect full cooperation moving forward." As Mason left the store, his mind was already racing with next steps. This was far from over. And he wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth. Mason left the jewelry store, his mind whirling with questions. Something wasn't right, and he could feel it in his bones. As he drove back to his office, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. Back at his desk, Mason dove into research. He pulled up records of recent incidents at the jewelry store, his eyes scanning the reports with growing concern. A pattern began to emerge, and it made his heart sink. Over the past 6 months, there had been 5 separate incidents involving black teenagers being accused of theft at the same store. In each case, the teens had been detained and questioned, only to be released later when no evidence was found. Mason leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. This couldn't be a coincidence. As he dug deeper, another detail caught his eye. In 4 out of the 5 cases, Mrs. Hawthorne had been present or involved in reporting the supposed suspicious behavior. "This can't be happening," Mason muttered to himself, his voice heavy with disbelief and anger. He pulled up Mrs. Hawthorne's file, his eyes narrowing as he read through her background. She was the wife of a local judge, well-connected and influential in the community. But as Mason delved deeper, he found whispers of past complaints against her, all carefully buried or dismissed. Mason's concern deepened with each new piece of information. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was becoming clear that there was a larger issue at play, one that involved racial profiling and potential abuse of power. He picked up a framed photo of Lily from his desk, her bright smile beaming back at him. "I'm going to fix this, sweetheart," he promised softly. "For you, and for all the other kids who've been wrongly accused." Mason set the photo down and stood up, determination etched on his face. He knew the road ahead would be challenging. Taking on someone like Mrs. Hawthorne, with her connections and influence, wouldn't be easy. But he had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when it came to protecting the innocent. "Time to get to work," he said to himself, grabbing his jacket. He had leads to follow, witnesses to interview, and a truth to uncover. Mason Bennett was on a mission. And he wouldn't rest until he got to the bottom of this troubling pattern of injustice. Mason delved deeper into Mrs. Hawthorne's background, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he searched through databases and public records. His eyes widened as he uncovered a crucial piece of information. Mrs. Hawthorne was the wife of Judge Samuel Hawthorne, a local judge with a controversial history. "Well," Mason muttered, leaning back in his chair. "What do we have here?" He pulled up Judge Hawthorne's case history, focusing on rulings involving racial discrimination. As he scrolled through the records, a troubling pattern emerged. In case after case, Judge Hawthorne had ruled against plaintiffs claiming racial discrimination, often dismissing their complaints on technicalities. Mason's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about Mrs. Hawthorne anymore. It was becoming clear that her actions might be part of a larger systemic issue. Determined to gather more evidence, Mason set out to interview witnesses from previous incidents at the jewelry store. He started with Claire, a college student who had been working at the coffee shop across the street. "I remember seeing that woman there a lot," Claire said, her brow furrowed. "She always seemed to be watching the younger customers, especially if they were black. It made me uncomfortable." Mason nodded, jotting down notes. "Did you ever see her interact with the store staff?" Claire's eyes lit up with recognition. "Actually, yes. She was always whispering to them, pointing out customers. It seemed off. As Mason interviewed more witnesses, a clear pattern began to emerge. Mrs. Hawthorne had been present during multiple incidents, always singling out young black customers as suspicious. One witness, an elderly man named Mr. Johnson, shook his head sadly as he recounted what he'd seen. "It's a shame, really," Mr. Johnson said. "Those kids were just trying to shop, same as anyone else. But that woman, she'd watch them like a hawk, then go running to the staff. Next thing you know, security's involved." Mason's notebook filled up with similar accounts. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, painting a disturbing picture of racial profiling and discrimination. Back at his office, Mason spread out his notes, connecting the dots between Mrs. Hawthorne's complaints and the subsequent incidents. He created a timeline, marking each event and noting the similarities. "This can't be a coincidence," he said to himself, staring at the evidence before him. The pattern was clear. Mrs. Hawthorne had consistently targeted young black customers, filing complaints that led to their detainment and questioning. Mason sat back, running a hand through his hair. He knew he was onto something big, something that went beyond just one incident with his daughter. This was about a systemic issue of racial profiling, one that had been going on for far too long. Mason's investigation took an unexpected turn when he stumbled upon a crucial piece of information. As he delved deeper into Lucas Harrow's background, he discovered a surprising connection that made his heart race. "Well, I'll be damned," Mason muttered, staring at his computer screen. It turned out that Lucas's brother, James Harrow, was a high-profile defense attorney. What caught Mason's attention wasn't just James's impressive client list, but one particular name that stood out. Hawthorne. Mason leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the document. James Harrow had represented Mrs. Hawthorne and her husband, Judge Samuel Hawthorne, in various legal matters over the years. The connection was undeniable. "This can't be a coincidence," Mason said to himself, his mind racing with possibilities. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture that was far more complex than he had initially imagined. It wasn't just about racial bias anymore. There was something deeper, more sinister, at play. Mason picked up his phone and dialed his partner, Agent Elena Morales. "Elena, I need you to dig into Lucas Harrow's financials," he said as soon as she answered. "Look for any unusual transactions or connections to the Hawthorne family." "On it," Elena replied. "What are you thinking, Mason?" Mason sighed heavily. "I'm thinking this whole incident with Lily might be part of a larger scheme. Lucas's brother has represented the Hawthorne family. It's possible Lucas was influenced to target Lily specifically." "That's a serious accusation," Elena warned. "We need solid evidence." "I know," Mason agreed. "That's why we need to be thorough. This could go beyond just one incident of racial profiling. We might be looking at a pattern of corruption involving the police, the courts, and who knows what else." As Mason hung up the phone, he felt a mix of determination and unease. The case had taken a turn he hadn't expected, and the implications were far-reaching. If his suspicions were correct, it meant that the incident wasn't just a random act of bias. It was a calculated move in a much larger game. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began mapping out the connections. Mrs. Hawthorne. Judge Hawthorne. Lucas Harrow. James Harrow. All linked in a web of potential corruption. And at the center of it all, his daughter, Lily. Unwittingly caught in their crosshairs. Mason's jaw clenched as he stared at the diagram. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory. These were powerful people with a lot to lose if their schemes were exposed. But he couldn't back down now. Not when his daughter's safety, and the integrity of the justice system, were at stake. Mason sat at his desk, poring over the latest report he'd received. His eyes widened as he read the details, and he let out a low whistle. The missing necklace, the very one Lily had been accused of stealing, had actually been reported stolen weeks before the incident. "This doesn't add up," Mason muttered, shaking his head. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, determined to get answers. The drive to the jewelry store felt longer than usual, his mind racing with questions and theories. As Mason pushed open the store's glass door, the soft chime of bells announced his arrival. The manager, Mr. Spencer, looked up from behind the counter, his smile faltering as he recognized Mason. "Agent Bennett," Mr. Spencer said, his voice tight. "What can I do for you today?" Mason approached the counter, his eyes locked on the manager. "I need to talk to you about the missing necklace, Mr. Spencer. The one my daughter was accused of stealing." Mr. Spencer's smile disappeared completely. "I thought we had cleared that up, Agent Bennett. It was a misunderstanding." Mason pulled out a copy of the report. "According to this, that necklace was reported stolen 3 weeks before the incident with my daughter. Care to explain?" The color drained from Mr. Spencer's face. He fumbled with his glasses, avoiding Mason's gaze. "There must be some mistake," he stammered. "I don't think so," Mason pressed. "This report is quite clear. So why was my daughter accused of stealing a necklace that had already been reported missing?" Mr. Spencer took a deep breath, seeming to gather himself. "It was a simple error, Agent Bennett. The necklace was thought to have been returned. We must have forgotten to update the report." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Forgotten? That's a pretty big thing to forget, Mr. Spencer, especially when it led to an innocent teenager being accused of theft." The manager's explanation felt hollow, raising more questions than it answered. Mason could feel his suspicion growing with each passing moment. There was more to this story, and he was determined to uncover it. "I'd like to see your inventory records," Mason said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And any security footage from the day that necklace was supposedly returned." Mr. Spencer's eyes darted nervously around the store. "I'm not sure I can provide that without consulting our legal team," he stammered. Mason leaned in closer, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Spencer, I hope you understand the seriousness of this situation. If there's something you're not telling me, now would be the time to come clean." The manager's silence spoke volumes. Mason could almost see the gears turning in the man's head, weighing his options. Whatever was going on here, it was clear that the jewelry store was involved in something far more complex than a simple misunderstanding. Mason left the jewelry store, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. He knew he needed more information. And his next lead was closer to home. With a deep breath, he dialed a number he rarely used. "Officer Grant, it's Agent Bennett. I need to talk to you about Lucas Harrow." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mason, you know I can't discuss internal matters," Officer Grant replied, his voice hesitant. "I'm not asking for anything official," Mason assured him. "Just a conversation between old friends. Can we meet?" An hour later, Mason sat across from Officer Grant in a quiet corner of a local diner. The older man looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around as if expecting to be overheard. "What's this about, Mason?" Grant asked, his voice low. Mason leaned forward. "I need to understand Lucas's behavior, his connection to Mrs. Hawthorne. There's something not right about the incident with my daughter." Grant sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, Lucas is complicated. He and his brother, they're close. Real close." Mason's eyebrows raised. "His brother? The defense attorney?" Grant nodded. "Yeah. well, they look out for each other. If one's in a tight spot, the other's always there to help out. Help out how? Mason pressed. Grant shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. I shouldn't say more. But, let's just say if Lucas ever finds himself in hot water, his brother's always there to cool things down. And vice versa. Mason felt a chill run down his spine. This was more than he'd expected. And Mrs. Hawthorne? How does she fit into all this? Grant's eyes widened slightly. Mrs. Hawthorne? I don't know anything about that. But Mason could see the flicker of recognition in the officer's eyes. There was a connection there, something Grant wasn't saying. Thank you for your time, Officer Grant, Mason said, standing up. You've been very helpful. As he walked out of the diner, Mason's mind was racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Lucas and his brother, covering for each other. Mrs. Hawthorne, with her connections to the local judge. And now, a falsely reported stolen necklace. There was more to this than just racial bias. Mason was now certain that Lucas had been influenced, maybe even coerced, into targeting Lily. But why? What was the bigger picture he was missing? Mason got into his car, his determination stronger than ever. He would uncover the truth. No matter where it led him. For Lily. And for justice. Mason sat at his desk, poring over the files he had gathered. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. But the picture they formed was more complex than he had initially thought. He rubbed his tired eyes, trying to make sense of the information in front of him. As he flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. Mason's eyes widened as he realized the implications. Mrs. Hawthorne's name appeared repeatedly in connection with jewelry insurance claims. Each claim coincided with reports of stolen jewelry from the same store where Lily had been accused. This can't be a coincidence, Mason muttered to himself, his heart racing. He picked up his phone and dialed a trusted contact at the insurance company. After a brief conversation, his suspicions were confirmed. Mrs. Hawthorne had filed multiple claims over the past year, each for substantial amounts. Mason leaned back in his chair, the weight of this new information settling on his shoulders. It wasn't just about racial profiling anymore. This was a carefully orchestrated fraud scheme. And Lily had unwittingly become a pawn in Mrs. Hawthorne's game. She needed a scapegoat, Mason said aloud, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. And Lily was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He thought about his daughter, how shaken she had been after the incident. The injustice of it all made his blood boil. Mrs. Hawthorne hadn't just wronged Lily. She had manipulated the system, using racial bias as a smokescreen for her criminal activities. Mason stood up, determination filling him. He needed to act fast. This new information changed everything. It wasn't just about clearing Lily's name anymore. It was about exposing a larger conspiracy, one that had likely affected many innocent people. He picked up his phone again, this time calling his supervisor. Sir, I need to brief you on a development in the case involving my daughter, Mason said. It's bigger than we thought. As Mason explained the situation, he could hear the surprise in his supervisor's voice. This is serious, Bennett, his supervisor said. We'll need to involve the fraud division. How solid is your evidence? Solid enough to warrant a full investigation, Mason replied confidently. But we need to move quickly. If Mrs. Hawthorne realizes we're onto her, she might try to cover her tracks. After hanging up, Mason took a deep breath. The case had taken an unexpected turn. But he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for Lily now. He was fighting for justice on a much larger scale. And he wouldn't stop until the truth was exposed. Mason sat back in his chair, the weight of everything settling on him. He had uncovered a carefully orchestrated fraud scheme, but he knew that bringing down someone as well-connected as Mrs. Hawthorne wouldn't be easy. His instincts told him she had powerful allies protecting her, and that meant he needed airtight evidence that would be undeniable in court. He grabbed his phone and dialed Elena Morales. "Elena, I need you to pull security footage from the street cameras around the jewelry store from the day of the incident," Mason said. "Already ahead of you," Elena replied. "I pulled the data and found something interesting. Meet me at the office." Mason wasted no time, heading straight to their field office. When he arrived, Elena was waiting with a serious expression. "I ran facial recognition on Mrs. Hawthorne for that day," she said, pulling up the footage on her laptop. Mason leaned in as the footage played. Mrs. Hawthorne could be seen inside the store, whispering to the manager. Moments later, the manager nodded and gestured toward Lily. Then, something caught Mason's eye. Just before Lily left the store, Mrs. Hawthorne slipped something into her purse. Mason's blood ran cold. "She planted the necklace," Mason said, his voice low with anger. Elena nodded grimly. "It looks that way. And here's the kicker, about 10 minutes after the confrontation outside, Mrs. Hawthorne gets into a black Mercedes. I traced the plates. Guess who the car is registered to?" Mason clenched his jaw. "Judge Hawthorne." Elena sighed. "Exactly. They were working together. This wasn't just about scamming insurance companies. This was about setting Lily up to take the fall." Mason's hands curled into fists. "They picked the wrong girl," he muttered. The takedown. Mason spent the next several days building the case. Every detail had to be perfect. He coordinated with the fraud division and local law enforcement, making sure there were no loose ends. The final step was getting a warrant. With the evidence they had gathered, security footage, witness statements, and fraudulent insurance claims, Mason met with the district attorney. "This is damning," the DA said after reviewing the file. "We can take this straight to the grand jury." Mason nodded. "I want this airtight. No room for them to wiggle out." "You've got it," the DA assured him. The next morning, arrest warrants were issued. Mason rode along as a team of agents and officers arrived at the Hawthorne estate. The massive, ivy-covered mansion stood as a monument to power and privilege, but today, that power was about to come crashing down. As soon as the front door opened, the agents moved in. Mrs. Hawthorne, dressed in an expensive silk robe, gasped in outrage. "You have no right," she started, but Mason cut her off. "Mrs. Hawthorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, insurance fraud, and filing a false police report," Mason said, pulling out his badge. "You have the right to remain silent." She sputtered in disbelief. "My husband, Hill." "Your husband is being arrested as we speak," Mason said coolly. Tears filled her eyes as realization dawned on her. Outside, Judge Hawthorne was being led away in handcuffs, his face red with fury. "This is an outrage," he shouted. "I'll have your badge for this." Mason smirked. "I don't think so. We have enough evidence to put you away for a long time." As Mrs. Hawthorne was escorted to the waiting car, Mason felt a sense of justice settling over him. Lily was safe. And the people who had tried to frame her were finally facing the consequences. But Mason knew the fight wasn't over. The aftermath. In the weeks following the arrests, the case against the Hawthornes made national headlines. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The fraudulent insurance claims, the security footage of Mrs. Hawthorne planting the necklace, and the testimony of multiple witnesses all painted a damning picture. At the trial, Mason sat beside Lily as the prosecution laid out their case. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Lily let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Mason squeezed her hand. "It's over, sweetheart." Lily nodded, tears of relief in her eyes. "Thank you, Dad." But Mason wasn't done yet. He knew that this case had revealed deep-rooted corruption in the system. He worked closely with local leaders to push for new policies to prevent wrongful accusations and racial profiling. He spoke at public hearings, using Lily's story to advocate for change. And 1 year later, standing at a podium in front of a crowd, Mason felt hope for the future. "This isn't just about one case," he said. "It's about making sure that what happened to Lily never happens again." Lily, now more confident than ever, stood beside him and spoke into the microphone. "We all deserve to be treated with fairness," she said. "No one should be judged by the color of their skin." The crowd erupted in applause. Mason smiled, pride swelling in his chest. Justice had been served. And together, they had made a difference. The end.